All right, guys, thank you so much. We are continuing again with our discussion and series going over Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin. Today we are picking up where we left off with the numinusum in soul. But before we do that, I want to, as quickly as I can, um, have a slight disclaimer. Now, in a couple videos back, I was uh, criticized, and I want to address that here. And the only reason why is because I think the criticism was built upon a misunderstanding, and I really hope that misunderstanding isn't widely pronounced amongst you guys. So all I'm really going to be doing here is clarifying some of my beliefs, um, and it is relevant to Gebser. So the criticism was twofold. One, that I believed Heidegger was a rationalist nihilist. Um, and then the other was about postmodernity and rationalism and how they ended rationalism. So we'll just take it one by one, and I'll try to be as quick as I can. Um, so Heidegger and the rationalist nihilist. Now, I can't remember saying that, I'll be honest. Even with my basic understanding of Heidegger, it doesn't sound like something I would say. Having said that, I am open to being proven wrong on that. So I think what it was Gebser's critique of Heidegger, and I must have added some comment at the end of that. So let's refresh ourselves. So what is Gebser's critique of Heidegger? That he displayed a rationalism. How? Being and non-being. This will be for all you philosophy guys out there. Being and non-being. Duns Scotus, seemingly, I could never verify this myself, posited these two as polar complements, the mythical consciousness structure. Excuse me. So the 2D flat circle, yin and yang, you got it. Heidegger, of course, switched, from polar complementarity to dualistic antithesis. So no longer is being and non-being yin and yang. Now they negate each other. They are not the same, and they must be rationally reconciled. Now, Gebser would say you took a polar complement and you turned it into a dualistic antithesis, and that was a fatal flaw. This is why it's seemingly you get the being of being and the nothing of nothingness. Now, as someone on the outside of philosophy, I have a great respect for Heidegger. But having said that, I've had people that I respect and who are academics say that there are times that Heidegger borderlines on self-parody when he gets so lost in the abstract, and I think that's what Gebser's talking about. You've taken one and you try to get into the other. So you start with being and you try to get to non-being, or you start with non-being and you try to get to being. And of course, you're getting more and more abstract. This is rationalism 101, right? So not only are you falsely framing these according to Gebser, now philosophy students, you may disagree with this. As much as I love them, just because Gebser says something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It becomes true if it's real, right? If it corresponds to reality. Um, but if it doesn't, then it doesn't. Then so be it. Maybe he made a bad critique. Just because someone makes a critique doesn't mean that critique is worth anything. If I critiqued you watching this video for insulting my child and stealing $1,000 from me, you've never done either of those things. So that critique is warrantless. So there you go. So that's number one. So what happened? Instead of the polar complements, you framed them as dualistic antithesis, and you divided and divided and divided until you got so abstract that we're completely lost and we're divorced from reality. That's number one. Number two, another rationalist mistake Heidegger made. He divided time, which is already a divider. Now, as I just said, time is a divider already, the mental conception of time, as I covered in this series. So when you start to divide something that is a divider, you destroy time. And what is time? A constituent of space. So in dividing and dividing and dividing and picking it apart and hair splitting time, that is to say, one manifestation of time, the mental time, the spatialized time, the deficient spatialized time. If you keep dividing and dividing and dividing, you will destroy time, and in doing so, you will destroy space because time is a constituent of space. So this is where I think the nihilism comes in. That is where what I imagine. If I added rationalist nihilist, that's probably where that comes from. If you're destroying space-time so that space cannot happen, it does seem a little nihilistic. Now, if you want to argue and say that's not the philosophical definition of not, okay, yeah, we got it. You know what I mean. Having said that, I do not believe Heidegger is a rationalist or a nihilist. I've lied in my life before. I don't consider myself a liar. Just because you've displayed rationalism here and there, I don't think that necessarily means in totality you are a rationalist. So let's take some of his other ideas. And again, this is just a basic understanding. So philosophy guys, please correct me if you think I'm wrong. But one, in what's the word? Um, in placing himself in opposition to his master Husserl, who did phenomenology. Now, phenomenology, at least my understanding, is we perceive something, we consider it real, and then we have all these emotional valuations sort of made. So my friend died. That's something that really happened, and that's really sad. That made me sad. That's bad. That's the natural attitude. But the phenomenologists say, no, let's bracket all of that. Let's say this isn't real, and let's just put all emotional and qualitative valuations aside. And we're just going to not even really consider it real in the sense of in the world, but we are going to intuitively, in a highly abstract sense, observe. And then in observing in that highly intuitive and abstract sense, we will be able to ascertain its real components or elements or whatever. Now that's bullshit to me. That's ridiculous. That's rationalism right there. That's abstract being placed in opposition to the out there or the external and being privileged over it. You made a big mistake. These are polar complements, not. That's just my opinion. I think phenomenology is pseudo philosophizing. That's my opinion. If you philosophy guys correct me down low. Um, but Heidegger said, yeah, we're done with that. So you're not just this floating, abstract, formless, essenceless, substanceless thing, if you even want to call it that. This droplet of milk in a glass of water where you just kind of hang there and you're like this formless little thing. I don't even know. We don't do that. So phenomenology's got to go. We belong in a world which is obviously Earth, and then a particular time in a particular place. That is saying epoch. So contemporarily, we're in 2025 in Western America. We have biases and we have all this stuff, all this baggage that needs to be incorporated with our abstract conceptualization, which of course phenomenology, at least to my understanding, didn't really take that into account. So in many ways, Heidegger is being integral. He is rejecting just the exclusive validity of phenomenology, and he is integrating the out there, which of course he would borrow from Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, I think, was psychoanalyzing Kant and all these guys. And you see, there is no absolute truth. There was a truth for Kant. That is to say, people with Kant's disposition will find something true because of that disposition. He's re-injecting the biases of the external world out there into our countenance. So that's pretty integral. Here's another thing: his different modes of being. So we have, I don't know all of these, Phusis, Vorhandenheit, Eidos, all that stuff. He doesn't seem to really privilege one or the other, and all the different truths, right? Truth as aletheia, truth as divine command, or whatever it is. So he has all these different modes of being and all these different modes of truth. Of course, the postmodernists seem to jump off that, and he's integrating them into a whole. And it doesn't seem like he's privileging that one much above the other. So that seems to be integral to me. He's trying to say the Western Vorhandenheit is not the only mode of being, and the other modes of being have other advantages and should be respected. Um, so that seems to be pretty integral to me. So yes, on Tuesday he was being a little rationalist. I'll admit to you to that, or I'll admit that to you, excuse me. But on what did I say, Wednesday or Tuesday? But the next day, he was being integral. So it's a little it's always complex. It's you don't want to get too lost. So on the whole, I do not believe that Heidegger was a rationalist, a nihilist, or anything like that. I believe he was integral on the whole, despite displaying some displays of rationalism. I lied sometimes. I don't consider myself a liar. I remember in eighth grade, I stole a bag of chips from a guy, and it made me feel bad. And I don't consider myself a thief. You know what I mean? Um, that's number one. Number two, postmodernity. I agree with you. So the critique was that postmodernity is not rationalism because postmodernity ended rationalism. Now I completely understand where this comes from. So I guess what John David Ebert calls it the metaphysical age, I think Derrida called it the logocentric age, right? From Plato all the way to what is it, Heidegger. Logocentric, order centric, which is a characteristic or element of what mode of thought? mental rational thought. There you go. The logocentric age. There you go. Um, and he's basically this idea that anytime there was an idea or a binary posited, there has been a particular rational interpretation that has just been accepted as the correct way to do things. But of course, as someone like Gebser would say, there are more ways of bringing objects in the world into relationship or into relation with each other than just this sort of causal rational reconciliation. And two, Derrida's saying, look, this is metaphysics. We don't necessarily have to abide by the same objective rules of science. And he probably didn't even believe those existed anyways. So, of course, this is what Derrida was doing. He was deconstructing the logocentric age. Now, incidentally, we're going to point out the hypocrisy of all postmodernists. Apparently, Derrida can chop up history into little phases and stages, and he calls it the logocentric age, and that's okay. You can do that. That's cool. But if I do it, and if Americans do it, and if someone else outside their little postmodern cult does it, they need to be deconstructed. That's not good. Gills and Deleuze and Guattari, they can do sign regimes, but don't you dare say the Romantic era. Don't do that. Ridiculous. So this is what Derrida was doing. So he took the binaries and he found a way philosophically. Let's say we have I don't know, essence versus appearance. That's a good one. So Plato, beginning with Plato, and why was Plato the beginning? Because he was the first real mental conscious structure philosopher. Maybe I'll pick up on that later. But starting with Plato, we said essence is more important than appearance. Why is this the case? Simply put, it comports more with rational thought. It is considered to be true rationally, so we do it. And then you have all these different binaries, and they privilege one over the other. That's how, of course, the mental conscious structure brings objects in the world into relation with each other. Binaries and either privileging of the one or the other or a synthesis. There you go. Beautiful. And Derrida deconstructed this. He said, no, I'm going to find a philosophical way to justify the other privileging. So we're going to privilege essence over appearance, and we're going to find some way. Maybe I'm a Humean, whatever. Or I'm just going to show that these are false binaries anyway. So there's nothing to, you're already on the wrong foot. These binaries aren't real. They're not valid. They don't exist. So there you go. So he deconstructed those, seemingly at least, in those two ways. So in one sense, undeniably, the postmodernists did, quote unquote, as the criticism said, kill rationalism. I do not deny that. Having said that, from a Gebserian perspective, it is still very, very interesting to consider what postmodernity was. Now, I believe it is a rationalist. But of course, I'm a little further ahead of you guys in the book. There's an interesting argument to be made about paradox. Maybe I'll pick up at that on the end, or at the end of the video. Excuse me, just had a stroke there. So yes, in a certain sense, they killed rationalism, undeniably. Of course, what they were really doing was deconstructing the mental consciousness structure. Okay. Having said that, think about what postmodernity is. It is the privileging of the individual, Foucault, and is the dividing of him from all aspects of the outer society. If you were to take Foucault seriously, you would quite literally be forced to not accept a single knowledge claim that any other person would ever tell you ever, because they have constructed an oppressive epistemological process that they are now imposing on you. So not only have we privileged the individual, not only have we divided everything externally in the form of science, now our metaphysical faculties have been so divided, that they've become shredded. They're completely, all of them are pieces on the floor, and no piece is superior than another. And the reason why I think it's rationalist is because they have no attempt, they don't like unity. Their whole thing is a philosophy of negation. That's the whole point. So they don't unify like the integral consciousness structure does. So that's why I think that postmodernity is a sublimated form of rationalism that killed and deconstructed the previous manifestation or form of rationalism. That is to say, the more traditional mental consciousness structure, binaries, and stuff like that. I'm definitely open to a discussion about that, though. I don't want it to seem like any of these opinions I can't be moved on, because I can. So I know that took a little longer than I thought, but I think it's important to clarify where I'm coming from, clarify my beliefs, and kind of show you guys where I'm at, where I'm coming from when kind of engaging in this Gebser stuff. What else? Yeah, like I said, the only reason I just addressed that here now in this video is because I really hope that misunderstanding wasn't pronounced amongst you guys. And yeah, so now that you guys know my beliefs, you guys can, when you critique me, it's a little more cutting. It's a little more sharp because it cuts to exactly what I believe. And that's good because that'll help me grow. Now, what was I going to say? Fuck. Oh, maybe I'll think of it. And that will be okay. So that's what it was. So the real criticism, put simply, is that I'm grasping at the dark in the dark. I'm sort of walking around and I'm grasping. That critique on the whole is 100% correct. I would never deny that. I've made it very clear that I'm not a philosophy student. I'm not certainly not a professor. I don't read a ton of. I try to read the primary sources, but I just got into learning, a few years ago, and there's a lot of stuff to read, and it takes a lot of time, and I have a life out here. So that is true. That is undeniable. So if you guys think you guys can lighten my trail, so to speak, please do in the comments. I want that. It is true that I'm wandering in the dark a little bit, grasping for whatever I might find, but at least I have a flashlight. So with all that out of the way, let's get into Gebser. 16 minutes into the video. Okay, so we're continuing with our discussion of the numinosum. Quote, here we should introduce a term at least as important for the phenomenon of history as recollection, namely the numinosum. Numinosum. It was coined by the Moravian pietist Zinzendorf, who first used it in his treatise Natural Thoughts on the Nature of Religion, where he spoke of the sensus numinus. The concept was later reformulated in 1917 without mention of Zinzendorf by Rudolf Otto in his book, some German crap, Bayern Munich. That's what the book was called, Borussia Dortmund. That's what it was called, and further developed in his later work, The Sense of the Transcendent. This latter work is a discussion and critique of the positivistic theory of religion of Wilhelm Wundt, as elaborated in his monumental Volker Psychology, as well as of the animism which began with the work of E.B. Tylor, and of the pre-animism formulated by R.R. Moret. So if you guys are interested in some of that esoteric stuff, that's why I mentioned this in this video, because it's cool to hear some of the references he makes to these weird esoteric guys. All right, this is very important. Quote unquote numinous, derived from the Latin numen, N-U-M-E-N, quote, divine power or rule, is an articulation of the pre-rational and irrational components of religious holiness, and is primarily concerned with the vital experience rather than with any valuative or ethical category. Very, very important. I'm going to repeat for emphasis. Numinous, meaning divine power or rule, or excuse me, numinous is an articulation of the pre-rational and irrational components of religious holiness, and is primarily concerned with the vital experience rather than with any valuative or ethical category. Now, I'm actually not going to describe it too much because there's a really, Gebser just puts it so much better than I do. But it is exactly that. An experience, you can understand it mentally. I'm not saying you can't. Obviously, we can because we're reading about it. But it is an experience with all its automatic and instinctual characteristics and flux and dynamism that happens when you encounter something so quote unquote otherworldly that it activates the irrational and pre-rational aspects of you and stimulates them to such a point that they completely override any rational thoughts you may have. It is an experience of religious trembling and holiness. It is beyond any profundity that can come from A is greater than B and B is greater than C, so A is greater than C. It is an experience that is transformative, and it is focused mainly, even though it's part mythical, but mainly in the magical consciousness structure and all that power and potency of pure experience that affords us. All right, now we're going to get into some cool etymology stuff. On the other hand, we must take note of the fact that the adjective quote unquote holy German Heilig, H-E-I, where'd it go? L-I-G, is related to the word for heal, heilen, and to its adjective hail, which have close ties to English quote-unquote whole. All of them are most likely traceable to the same Indo-Germanic root kel, which we discussed earlier. Source of the word pair whole, hell. So whole would be H-O-L-L-E and then H-E-L-L-E, i.e. hell, brightness. The expression numinous circumscribes a very specific sphere of vital experience, religious quote-unquote trembling, tremendum, the awe and thrill of man's encounter with the quote-unquote completely other. Okay. And then he says, let's see. The concept of the numinous is an attempt to grasp and define a primordial experience, and this experiential character places it not only within the context of mythical psychic experience, but particularly within the sphere of the pre-rational vital sphere of magic. So the concept, which is exactly that, a mental concept, as he says, an attempt to grasp and define a primordial experience that is ultimately, for the most part, indefinable. It's not conducive towards rational measurement. That's the whole point with a numinous experience. It's got nothing to do, you cannot rationally measure these things. Oh, I know exactly what happened and everything just worked out. No, that's not how it works. Let's see. The pre-rational vital sphere of magic. Both realms, that of magic and mythical, are responses to the numinosum. It expresses man's predominantly emotional reaction to experiences which he cannot comprehend or understand. Repeat for emphasis. No, I'm not even going to add anything after that. It expresses man's predominantly emotional reaction to experiences which he cannot comprehend or understand. Beautiful. In a sublimated form, the numinous experience still exists within our culture, as many a devout Catholic or Protestant can attest. The feeling of religious awe, the pious shiver which overwhelms him or her during the sacramental rites. So there you go. It's an example of a numinous experience that still happens today. There are others, and I think he mentions it. A child who, let's take my little nephew, who's like 2, 3 years old. If he hears a loud thunderstorm, he's going to start crying. You know why he's going to start crying? Because he encountered something that was so other and so powerful that it could not help but affect him emotionally to the point where it started crying. He could not rationally account for it. So that's another example. We have numinous experiences all the time today, especially when you're younger and you're not a rationalist. Let's see. But the concept is not just restricted to the religious sphere. We have noted above that its effectuality is still visible in the original sense of the word history. Now remember, the original sense of the word history integrated both man as a directing agent, where we say, okay, then this happened, then Napoleon got cheated on, and then he went and go conquered that. Then he came back, then he sat in the corner and watched a little cuck, got cucked again, and then that happened. We're directing, right? We're directing history. We decide what follows what. Or events in the world are so miraculous or phenomenal or overpowering that they have directed themselves toward us. All we need to do is stop being too cool for school rationalists and realize, oh, okay, there's a world outside here. Okay, and there's all this stuff going on. All we have to do is say, yes, I'm going to codify this obvious direction that the world is impressing upon me. So there you go. What we might call its numinous background is the residuum of historical events and experiences beyond our understanding and frequently inexplicable in causal terms. The religious attitude of our forefathers predisposed them to experience such events as quote unquote completely other, that is, as numinous. And they would have believed in the participation of this numinosum in what we call history. So that's the thing. The numinous, these forces, energies, and powers that transmit themselves into objects that impress upon us in a very powerful way, pre-rational and irrational way, that was a part of history. Again, we're reattaining the world as a directing agent on us and not just us on the world. It's almost think of it almost like Hegel's absolute with the thesis antithesis, synthesis. The absolute has sort of created this pattern and cycle, and then it only comes to awareness both in and because of man. So the absolute is a catalyst and manipulator of history, not just man. This attitude, of course, has as little validity for enlightened Europeans or pragmatic Anglo-Saxons as it does for Russians trained in the dialectic tradition who are all convinced, although unmindful of the warning of overconviction inherent in the word convinced, that they can with impunity explain all historical phenomena in terms of ideology, social structure, economy, or the like. So all you Marxists out there who think you can predict history and know all of history through your stupid dialectical materialist movement ain't gonna happen, my friend. It will never happen because one, you're not incorporating the numinosum or this, at least the integral understanding of history of the world as a directing agent, and two, the dialectic is just too limited. I'm sorry, it just is. If we inquire into the history of soul and spirit, we are setting out to discover the genesis of the concept of soul. As a concept, it already belongs to the mental structure, but as an effectual potency, the awakening awareness of a soul has, as noted earlier, left its imprint on the mythical structure. So, of course, we will be employing the mythical way of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other to ascertain knowledge and attain the effective potency of the soul. And the presence of this quote unquote soul appears to be irretrievably lost in the darkness of the magic structure, since it becomes visible only with the dawning of myth. So there you go. So in the magic structure, remember, all the aspects are in us and they must be brought out. They must be sort of teased out and progress and unfold, but they're already in us. So the soul, that was gone in the magic structure, was lost in the darkness. But with the mythical structure, that was the preceding discovery that allowed it to mutate, form, consolidate. It is primarily to the researches of comparative anthropology that we owe our knowledge of manifestations of quote-unquote primitive tribes and cultures. There we find a key term which has afforded a basis for redefining the notion of the numinosum and which will be useful for our discussion. It is the Melanesian-Polynesian word mana, first mentioned in a letter of R. H. Codrington published by the noted Oxford Indologist F. Max Muller in 1878. In the letter, as well as in the book The Melanesians, Codrington defined mana as, is important, Codrington defined mana as a power or an effect in a certain sense supernatural and definitely not physical, which manifests itself in strength of body or in any kind of power or ability of man which is capable. This mana is not restricted to objects but can be transmitted by nearly any object. Spirits possess it and are able to transmit it. The Melanese religion as a whole is based on this fact that man can obtain mana for himself and is able to apply it to his own advantage. Big, big point. So mana is an invisible, quantifiably immeasurable force or power that is manipulated and transmitted by spirits through objects and people. And once it is transmitted into those objects or people, they level up in terms of capability or power. So me on a Wednesday, it's normal. On Thursday, I have mana imparted to me. Now I have essentially the powers of Superman. Or at least that's how it was perceived back then. So we have a bunch of numinous experiences that override our intellectual capacities, stimulate our irrational and pre-rational capacities to the point where they have just transformed us. And in turn, a mana, which is essentially a psychological projection, is imparted onto the object or event that caused the numinous experience. So we're going to go into more detail here. G. Vanderloo has commented on this revealing definition on the basis of parallel information from other cultures. Let's see. Wherever something unusual, something enormous, potent, or successful is found, it is spoken of as mana. Natural, that is, predictable events never serve as the basis for mana. Something is mana if it has an effect, and if it doesn't, it isn't mana, remarks an inhabitant of the island of Hokart. Mana can mean good fortune, vein, French for luck, vein, as well as power. So even luck, and I think we kind of talk about synchronicities And that could be seen as mana as well. For these definitions, we would also add Rudolf Otto's comment on this quote-unquote power. Quote, whatever is grasped as power is also grasped as a tremendum. It renders its objects taboo, T-A-B-U. This shows that the concept of power or might is not to be interpreted as being intrinsically one-sided and deficient, since it serves primarily to express effectivity or an effect. It is a power which renders something holy by being taboo, that is, by making things untouchable and ineffable holy. So, of course, T-A-B-U, taboo, is where we get T-A-B-O-O from. So we have the numinous experience. Let's say it's an object, right? Let's say we're in 10,000 BC, and all of a sudden we see a Sprite bottle, just randomly, or a Dr. Pepper can. We can't account for this. This is a numinous experience. It has power. It has a certain power to do something, which affects us, which in turn causes us to do rituals and all that stuff. Great. That soda bottle, that Sprite can, is taboo. You do not touch the numinous mana-powered object. That, my friend, is stirring up bad forces, bad spirits, and that will be a problem. So when mana is imparted to an object, that object becomes taboo. So people do not mess with it. And if they do, it's going to be after a lengthy, lengthy ritual for those same reasons that they did rituals in the magic consciousness structure on anything. So very important. Gebser continues, it is predominantly this effect arising from the already lost shelter of wholeness and belonging to the arcane, which because of this mystery is always something quote-unquote completely other. The idea of the holy contains this effect just as the sheltering cavern or the surrounding and protective circle, which is a quote-unquote whole, are also intact and embody a healing effect. And then he says, it is early man's primordial experiences and experience of the numinosum that prompt him to impart mana character to those things, events, or actions which form the basis of the concept of soul. Let me repeat for emphasis. It is early man's primordial experiences and experience of the numinosum that prompt him to impart mana character to those things, events, or actions which form the basis of the concept of soul. So in the magic world, we impart the mana, the power, and in the mythical structure, we look back at the mana and we say, there's a power in here as well. And that allows us to think, yes, we recognize the external power. Can we recognize and identify the internal power? Which they do, of course. Let's see. Yeah, I wrote a note here. It says, science comes along to rationally account for what the magic man couldn't, attributing mana to it. So that's how the mental conscious structure sort of deals with this sort of irrational or pre-rational stuff. Let's see. Okay. He says, having briefly surveyed the most important attempts of ethnology and the psychology of religion to clarify the question of the origin of the soul, that's what he did. It's not that relevant. We would like to examine more closely the nature of the numinous experience, which may have been favorable to this origin. We shall follow the resume of Schmallenbach from his paper noted above, for despite his pronounced rationalistic position and philosophical approach, it is a most useful summary as it includes most of the discoveries and conclusions by ethnographers and psychologists of religion. He writes, so this long paragraph I'm about to read is a really great example of the numinous effect, the experience, how it happens, and what happens after. Quote, according to Schmallenbach, quote, anything can be the object of numinous experiencing, although certain objects have a particular propensity for it. As the experience as such is a withdrawal from the familiar, because of its nature as the quote-unquote completely other, it shows a preference for objects outside the range of daily events. Shows a preference for objects outside the range of daily events. You are not going to have a numinous transformative experience by looking at a book. On the other hand, certain things have a heightened ability to evoke numinous attraction and feeling because of their particular constitution. Spurting, coagulating, surging, and smelling blood, for instance, or the pulse and breathing of someone asleep. Shadows in the midday sun, at dusk, at night, a dead man, the rigid, Immobile corpse, the phallus. I thought it was interesting that he said the phallus. That seems to be pretty natural. You would obviously see that on a daily basis. I think it's very interesting that he says phallus. The entire sphere of the phallic, dream images and names, the metallic body of lizards and snakes, the primordial eye of cattle, nocturnal animals like owls and bats, the whole animal realm more than the human, death more than life. So when he says the whole animal realm more than the human, that corresponds to Joseph Campbell's sort of epoch of the animal powers, where animals were the object of religious and numinous experience, and they were imparted with mana. And then, of course, things changed. Then man, once rationality and the strong subject came up, all of a sudden we started becoming the numinous objects. Let's see. Animal realm. Then there are the disk or crescent of the moon with its uncanny light, phosphorescent tree trunks, will-o'-the-wisps haunting the swamps, and many sounds and noises, especially the crackling or rustling of branches or twigs, drums, cymbals, and fifes. In short, everything is suitable for numinous experience, even the most commonplace items, my doorstep on which I always tread, familiar from long use with no other apparent import than as a path leveler at my threshold. Then one day, in the noonday sun, something mysterious begins to stir within it. It glistens at me in a strange, half covert, precarious, and enticing way. I am seized by awe and shudder, and run away in fear perhaps, hair on end. But at the very opposite, a vital attraction triumphs in me, drawing me back although not completely dispelling my misgivings. I take the object to me, knowing that I hold something precious replete with wondrous powers in which I, as its possessor, share to the fullest. So the door, what do you say it was? The doorstep, which normally we don't even think about it, just we automatically consider it. Even that can have. So I guess that's where the phallus comes in. So even under a certain light or just at a certain way of perceiving, you can have a numinous experience, and then you could attain power over the doorstep, which not everyone can do, I guess, if you got crutches. All right, so Gebser says, from these findings of the history of religion, notably the discriminating work of Soderblom and Vanderloo. Soderblom is Soderblom, and Vanderloo is Vanderleeuw. So if you're interested in this stuff, you want to learn about it, Gebser seems to note that these two knew what they were doing. They didn't bog down everything with just irrational nonsense. From these findings of the history of religion, we know that all of those earlier concepts, which until recently were rendered by the terms soul, spirit, and God, are more accurately explained in terms of mana and power. Interesting. So we know that all those earlier concepts, which until recently were rendered by the terms soul, spirit, and God, are more accurately explained in terms of mana and power. That's really what these old religious ideas were coming from. It's downstream from the magical structure. In all these instances, we are faced with primary numinous phenomena in various forms. These include Egyptian Ba, whose plural Baal, B-A-W, denotes now soul, now power, and even sometimes divine being or predecessor. So you're seeing the connections there. It's not just Western. The Egyptians also had in Ba or Baal, there was a connection between soul and God, as he said, soul, spirit, and God, and power, mana. Beautifully represented. They also include other Egyptian designations for soul, Ka and Iach, I-A-C-H-W, Old Iranian Frawashki, F-R-A-W-A-S-C-H-I, my goodness, or Furwers, F-E-R-W-E-R-S, guardian spirits or genies of light and life, which are depicted in Persian art as a spiritual ego, a doppelganger, hovering over man. Pretty interesting, right? I always like. Sometimes I like including that stuff, just because it's weird and it's cool. It's interesting. The same is true of Mexican muitsix, M-U-I-T-S-I-X, of the innumerable forms of soul and spirit found among various quote-unquote primitives, or of the wealth of numinous designations to be found even in Homer, where psyche is not the only designation for soul, but is merely one alongside such words as etor, E-T-O-R, ker, K-E-R, we covered that one. Nous, N-O-O-S, thymos, boule, B-O-U-L-E, menos, and metis. So we're going to repeat for all you philosophy students. I know I got a couple of you in there. Homework, where psyche is not the only designation for soul, but is merely one alongside such words as etor, care, nous, thymos, boule, boule, menos, and metis. Etor, E-T-O-R, refers not only to the heart, but also means life, vital force, courage, disposition, spirit, and soul. And originally, the viscera in general. What was the organ emphasis of the magic structure? Viscera. There you go. This change of meaning again reflects the shift of organ emphasis spoken of earlier. Etor, in the sense of viscera, belongs to the magic sphere, while in the sense of heart and disposition, it is already a part of the mythical. Kerr, with nearly the same range of meanings as etor, emphasizes the soul, and Kerr has the intended meanings of death and dying, and derives from the Indo-Germanic root Kerr, with the sense of, quote, to injure, strike. This root is contiguous to the roots Ker, Q-U-E-R, and Ger, G-H-E-R, which were invoked in the formation of the name of Kronos and his son Chiron. Ker also forms the basis of the names for the Greek goddess of misfortune and death, the Keris. To this group of Greek designations for the soul, which all have a numinous character, are the further words mentioned above, nous, thymos, boule, B-O-U-L-E, menos, and metis, each of which we should like to examine in that order. Nous, this will be interesting for you philosophy guys, nous meant originally sense, disposition, heart, divinity, and later power of thought, understanding, reason. Now, when I had an understanding of nous, which is just exactly that, of the mind, right? Like this sort of thought, reason, analytical stuff. But I didn't know it had that earlier meaning of, it had the more mythical interpretation, right? As you said, it was sense, disposition, heart, and divinity. These aren't really of the mind. Thymos had the general meaning of quote unquote soul and the quote unquote vital force localized in the diaphragm, as well as will, instinct, disposition, feeling, heart, and finally anger and sense. It is an outgrowth of the verbs thymu and thyo, which mean, quote, to anger, as well as, quote, to move violently, roust about, sacrifice, butcher, and murder. The Indo-Germanic root of all three words is do, so D-H-E-W, D-H-U, which means to move violently, breathe, sacrifice, and is closely akin to the root D-H-E, D-H-O, D-H-E-U, D-H-O-U, from which our word pair death deed derives. Boule, B-O-U-L-E, has the meaning of will, wish, opinion, and is associated with the verb boulomai, which expresses wishing, enjoyment, intention. What does wishing come from? Magic. You have wished, and it must be fulfilled. Fulfilled by what? The world, and the world is sort of this unified autonomous agent that can fulfill your wishes. Wish, enjoyment, intention, and comes from the Indo-Germanic gwel, G parentheses W-E-L, which is in turn closely related to kel, on which the word pair whole hell, cavern brightness, is based. And it will be no surprise that we again encounter the words menos and metis, together with the word menis, M-E-N-O-S, and M-E-T-I-S, together with the word menis, M-E-N-I-S. They form the point of departure for our observations on the mental structure, and express the directed psychic force embodied in the mythology of Athena or the directed anger of Achilles. Having entered awareness, this anger enabled man to direct the psyche, such direction being, of course, the principal characteristic of the mental structure. These quote-unquote concepts, these primarily numinous forms, are all distinguished by one characteristic: movement. It is either polar or then again partly severing, a movement of the heart or relating to life or to death, or a movement from within itself or aiming out of itself, out, and becoming visible where volition and intent appear, superseding mere wishfulness. So, after all that etymological connection and all those connections between ideas and concepts and feelings, what is the common through line? movement. The soul is always placed, it always moves, it is always in flux. It is not this still, static object like my little mouse key here. It is a 2D flat circle that moves between the life pole and the death pole. And when it is represented in mythical image, it will always be something that moves, whether it's a bird, whether it's the ocean, whatever. You must know that. The soul does not stay still, it is not a static object. It is a movement, a flux, a dynamic continuation. Moreover, he continues, it expresses the shift or upward trend of organ emphasis, which we were able to observe in the shift of meaning in the words etor and cur. So the shift, remember the magic is viscera, that's the organ emphasis. Then we go up to the heart, which is obviously shifting upward, right? And then we go, that's in the mythical structure, the heart, of course, the soul. And then in the mental, we have the brain, mind, right? That's in the head, that's obviously up. A similar shift occurred in those words mentioned in the preceding two paragraphs, which at first denoted the visceral magic zone, later the polar field of tension localized in the heart, and ultimately the emergent reason of thought. So that was the point of those two paragraphs of etymological connections. You were seeing how these words are defined, let's see, there are meanings of a word, and the meaning or meanings will depend on which structure is being used. And each word or concept goes through a transformation depending on which consciousness structure is engaging with it. So it starts with mystery, then it gets to the feeling and heart, then it gets to mind. It's kind of like nous. It starts with a sense, disposition, heart, and divinity. So that's what nous originally meant, and it makes sense that that's what it meant in the mythical structure, because we hadn't had the mental structure yet. But once the mental structure got a hold of it, all of it, what does it mean now? It means what we think it means, the mind, of mental. So interesting stuff. If we return to the non-Greek words characterizing quote-unquote soul and consider those expressing the multitude of soul forms dispersed throughout the world in time, we find that the gradual conscious awareness of the inner psychic dynamic movement expressed in these words begins to take on an outward shape. So now that we've silently reflected inward and we understand the movement of the soul with myth and symbol, now it's starting to be externalized. That's a good thing. You want that. In proportion to their propensity for projection, they denote souls, gods, demons, or spirits. They are personified, or at least reified, imagistic forms of intangible forces that make up man in the world. Such a beautiful way of putting it. So the myth is a way of putting to image those intangible and immeasurable forces that constitute the soul, that is constantly in movement. And that those forces that make up both man and the world. It is not just stories we tell each other that don't actually have any value. They can be essences, that is, potencies, or more correctly, effectualities that function as the departed vitality or life force only after man's death, as seems to be the case with Ka and Frawashi. So the soul could be a force or a power, or it could be something that leaves the body upon the last breath. Quite literally, with the last breath, it leaves out. So there's all these different manifestations of soul and its different forms. The key point is it's immeasurable. That's why that no one's agreeing on this like perfect yin and yang symbol. Like the yin and yang perfectly represents the mythical structure. You cannot think of a better symbol than that. You can't really do that with the soul because the soul is kind of immeasurable. It's by definition, it's always going to be hard to grasp, but they try. He says this connection between numinosity and the vital forces, which underscores its inherent dynamism, is of particular significance, as Soderblom writes. The close proximity of power and soul can be seen also in Hebrew nefesh, the word for soul, the life giver in man. Remember, power, that's mana, that's magical structure stuff, and then the soul. So the origin of the soul really does kind of come from the background of the magical structure. It would not have appeared without the mana impartation on objects that rendered a numinous experience on you. Now we are 49 minutes, and the problem is I did like 15 minutes of like a disclaimer, so I feel like I should give you guys some more. All right, I'm a little nervous because I don't know what I'm about to read. I didn't look through, but we're going to keep going because I love you guys. Okay. This discussion of previous scholarship on the numinosum and mana has necessarily required us to quote definitions that show a bewildering array of terms like potency, power, effectuality. We're hopeful that our use of these words and the discussion so far has been sufficiently careful so that the quoted definitions at least do not cause any confusion as to terminology. And we wish to know with particular emphasis that the terms strength or power and might or force are not identical, since might is always usurped, that is, misused strength. So that's sort of Gebser's opinion. I'm kind of hoping he expands on that. So he doesn't get into it here. Let's see. There has been until now no successful attempt to discover or trace with precision the emergence of soul from the jungle of various representations of soul. The most penetrating and systematic to date is that of Vanderloo, who has brought some order into the nearly impenetrable thicket and overwhelming wealth of numinous representations. Some primitive tribes ascribe to a person up to 30 souls, and texts from the pyramids indicate the dead king, as such more powerful, possessed up to 14 Kas. These souls are not merely souls of name, blood, breath, and shadow. There are also those which depart the body only at death, others during life, still others which depart for intermittent periods. Some assume a separate existence after departing from the body. Some seem to lead a separate existence altogether. And there are also human, animal, vegetative souls, souls of mountains, caves, waters, objects, stars, and constellations. So think about, remember in one of my other videos where we were talking about mental time, and I skipped ahead and I talked about all the different manifestations of time forms. So you had like duration, you had relativity, you had all these different manifestations of time, because time is a quantifiably immeasurable um, energy that manifests in multiple different forms, unlike space, which is just kind of one, right? Think of it the same thing with soul, the same as this quantifiably immeasurable thing, power, energy, or force, and it manifests, as just explained, in all sorts of different ways. The only thing that it doesn't manifest as, unless you get into rationalism, is this single static my soul that's just this static thing, this static object that you can put in the back of your closet. No, that's not it. So keep that in mind. So the same way that time manifests in all these acategorical ways. Same thing with the soul. The soul manifests in a lot of acategorical ways where it's not easy to quantifiably measure and just be like, well, is it one soul or is it 14 souls? Are you leaving at death or life? Like, what is it? It's a complete free for all. From this enumeration, we can gain some idea of the dynamism, of the potency and vitality which, unchecked by mental capacities, held their spell and movement over the world of magic as well as of mythical man, and call forth the counter spells and counter movement of magic and myth. That dynamism, that potency, that power. This is what drove man up until the Renaissance and the ancient Greeks. Okay, so all when we like to go back and we like to mock them for being irrational morons, they did not have the rational balance that the mental conscious structure could confer on the unperspectable world, the mythical and magical structures. We think they're just idiots, but no, they're in many ways they're being possessed by the power inside. And when you don't have that ego that can step aside and balance it, then yeah, you're going to get a lot of violence. You're going to get a lot of nonsense, especially when the psychological and mythic images that appear to you in your mind can very easily be interpreted in a way where you go sacrifice someone now. And you feel compelled to because you don't have that balance, you don't have that restraint. If you have a nightmare or some sort of maybe mythical images emerging from the death pole of the soul, I could very easily see how someone would be like, okay, well, considering that dream is the corresponding or the natural correspondence and complement to waking consciousness, and therefore is just as valid as waking consciousness. I must live out these dreams. And then the dream told me to kill someone and sacrifice them for the gods, then I'm going to do it. So interesting. Quote, only if we recognize the potent abundance of numinous content can we estimate the enormous step necessary for the detachment and exteriorization of psychic energy psychological. When he says psychic, he means psychological. Of psychic energies before the sudden first quantum-like appearance at mental capacity around 500 BC. Evident, and for all you philosophy guys, In Parmenides' sentence, thinking and being is one and the same. That's how you know we're in the mental structure. Once the mental structure says no, the new way of bringing objects in the world in relation with each other and the means to do so, that is to say, rational thought, that is important. That is being. That is the ultimate importance. That's how you know we're in. The second that that was said, the new structure's up. Thinking and being is one and the same. And it says every sentence is a rigidifying positing. Let's see. From this. All right, yeah, that's pretty good. Because then we're getting into soul and spirit. So I think that's a pretty good way, pretty good spot to end off on. Thank you guys so much. I hope you guys learned something. And I'll be seeing you guys soon. I'm trying to think of pure rationalism videos. I got a few in my mind. I was thinking of doing, I'm not going to respond to, I mentioned once offhand that I was going to respond to Alex O'Connor's article, but I must have read like the first paragraph and just assumed it would have been rationalism because I read the whole thing and I realized like this is a stretch. If I'm doing a kill ration, this would be a stretch because he's not really talking about that. So I won't be doing that. But I'm thinking about kind of talking about my favorite stanzas that I've read, and I'm just new into poetry, so don't judge me. It's not exactly deep, and my interpretations aren't going to be deep either. But my favorite stanzas that get me out of my rationalist box, whether it's Holderlin, Goethe, Wordsworth, whatever, that can awaken the romantic aspects, that can awaken and make clear mythical structure and polarity and all this stuff, and even the integral consciousness. I'm going to put that one in there. So maybe keep your eyes out for that. I hope you guys enjoyed the Mondo Kane video. That was a fun video. I had a blast making that. And I'll see you guys soon. I'll see you guys next week, and we'll be talking about the relationship from soul to spirit. So hope you guys learned something. Thank you.